If you've watched this show long enough, you know that there are two things I love: history and film. Today, we get the best of both worlds. Today, we are joined by Mark O'Rourke, a U.S. Army veteran spearheading an independent feature film project about the compelling story of how the victory at Saratoga kept the flame of liberty burning in the darkest hours of the American Revolution. Enjoy the episode. Well, Mark, thank you for coming on the show. This is actually very good timing because 2 weeks ago I had Kevin Weddle on the podcast for his book, The Complete Victory, about the Saratoga campaign, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So thanks for coming on the show.
Well, absolutely, and no one should have to follow a Colonel or Doctor Kevin Weddle because it's sort of like a Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig, but he's actually a friend. I respect him, completely, and his book is, as everyone, if anyone watching the podcast hasn't read his book, they should. Just one, because it's the gold standard now for this history, but it's won 4 major awards since its release by the Oxford University Press in 2021.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal, and he's a super cool guy. He had a lot of good stuff to say. That was a really cool episode. Is he helping you out with the film at all?
Kevin Weddle is indeed one of our historic advisors, and we're really hopeful to do a companion series based on the totality of what happened in 1777 in upstate New York, based on his book. It's actually a great question. We have a dream team of historians, and the when I first started all of this, I hadn't yet made the association of friendship with Kevin Weddle, but I had the good fortune, of course, when we traveled down to West Point, and I met with their history department in the fall of 2017 is where I met Dr. James Kirby Martin, as many people would know, one of the finest historians we have in America. And so the screenplay is based off of his work and his knowledge of this history, and he supervised the screenwriter Bob Burris, in writing the screenplay. But Kevin Weddle is an advisor to our project, so we're very grateful to have him in the mix.
Man, that is so exciting. It People who know me and people who have watched my show for long enough know that the two things that I love probably more than anything else is American history and film. So having you on the show to talk about movies, talk about American history is absolutely amazing. So tell me about this film you're working on, Saratoga, The Turning Point. Um, yeah, just tell me exactly what you're trying to accomplish here.
Well, and Jake, I should have paused. I've done this each time I've been on a podcast. You got to express gratitude. So you could be very selective with who you bring onto your program. And I believe you're fairly new with, I don't know how many episodes you've had now, but first, congratulations on commencing your podcast. And it's just an honor to be on.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot. Thank you.
So I'm a history major from college. I was history and political science major, and I'm an Eagle Scout. And my parents and my scout troop, we would go to different historical places every month. And then I later went to law school. So I wouldn't certainly say I'm an historian. I'm a history buff, like many Americans. And but the reason for this project is simple, from my standpoint. So when I first graduated from law school, and I said this on the Rev 250 podcast with Jonathan Lane and Bob Allison, Dr. Allison, I was woefully out of shape when I left law school, and I just moved up to upstate New York. My identical twin brother, who's also an Army veteran, had given me a really fantastic specialized racing bike that I didn't know how to use. But through a number of neighbors, I began to participate in an avid cycling group, and I was by far the worst rider in the group initially. I later became, I think, one of the better members of the group, if not the best for a time. But we rode at the Saratoga National Historical Park, or the Saratoga Battlefield. You can't help but be inspired by the scenery there and the landscape. It's above the Hudson River. It's gorgeous. But I gradually started reading all of the signage and going to the visitor center, and I couldn't believe, as a native New Yorker, I'm from Long Island in New York City, but had spent much of my youth in upstate New York and the Catskills and the Finger Lakes region and the Adirondacks. And I said this on a prior podcast. I said, wait, what do you mean this is the Gettysburg of the Revolution? This is the turning point. I said, this can't be the singular turning point of the Revolution. And of course, there were other major inflection points or tipping points in the Revolution. The 10 days of Washington crossing the Delaware, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, and And of course, a strong case is to be made for all of the fighting and the like that was done under General Nathaniel Greene down in the South, particularly in South Carolina. But I think again, if we have intellectual honesty, we don't get to Yorktown if we don't have Saratoga. So I couldn't believe. I certainly knew that Benjamin Franklin had been dispatched to France and was striking out for a good period of the time that he was there. But I didn't know it was Saratoga, and certainly an overwhelming and complete victory, as Kevin Weddle puts it, a strategic victory. And really, the first major strategic victory of the war was Saratoga. We had certainly had earlier victories, but they were not game changers. And so I couldn't believe that here, right under my nose, being a proud native New Yorker, that this victory was the what reset the revolution. I said it on the last podcast, and I like to stir the pot a little bit. But we often say about the Battle of Lexington, right? That was a shot heard round the world. And I don't know if anyone has said this before, and of course the case could be made for Yorktown, but I think Saratoga is the surrender that was heard round the world. Because for your listeners, right, we went from being a colonial conflict, the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, the American War for Independence, and went from being a colonial conflict, a grudge between the colonists airing their grievances, and initially civilly and then spilling blood, but with the crown, with the British crown. But it then became a world war after Saratoga, with not only the French intervening militarily on our behalf, but of course the Dutch financing a large part of the war, and then the Spanish independently declaring war on the British crown, and then even a kingdom in southern Italy, the kingdom of Mysore. So it's an unbelievable story after Saratoga. So I'll pause, but it just the more I learned about the history, it was mind blowing. What a great story it is.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think that's a great way to put it. The surrender heard around the world because it really did reverberate around the globe, and I'm right there with you. That's one of the things that I've found so much joy in when starting this podcast is I've always been a very patriotic guy. I've always had a fascination with American history, and when I started this journey of mine, I was always a history buff. I read and I had a decent understanding of American history, but as I've progressed and had guests on and read their books, I've found stories that I didn't necessarily learn about in school or learn about in depth in school or on my own. And especially, in recent memory with Saratoga 2 weeks ago with Kevin, reading that book and discovering this story and how profound of an implication it had on American history was mind-blowing to me because it really was the turning point. I mean, I know it's called the turning point, but it really was. It had huge impacts, and you're right, we wouldn't have had Yorktown without Saratoga.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment if we could. And by the way, another plug for Kevin's book is that he brings, Kevin doesn't want to be known as an academician, even though he has a PhD from Princeton, studied under the venerable historian, I think, James McPherson. And then he was one of the more beloved and distinguished professors at the Army War College. But he's a soldier's soldier. He was a combat commander, and he's done expert staff rides to Civil War and World War II sites around the world. So he's also very charismatic, especially so for an historian. So he has really he's very gifted not only with his writing but the clarity with which he speaks about these topics. But so I always want to tell listeners and I always defer, of course, to the National Park Service and to the the very very able staff at the Saratoga National Historical Park and the Saratoga Battlefield. But as I've being a kid from Long Island and knowing a lot about all of New York State, I do see a connectivity. I don't want to just focus on what was happening in the Northern Department in the late fall of 1776 and 1777. I take a step back, as others have done, and you realize the Americans had a disastrous invasion of Quebec. It can't be overstated what a catastrophe that was. And then psychologically, and even just as the opening, one of the phases of the war, especially after the euphoria of capturing Fort Ticonderoga so early. But then we have the very bitter, protracted Boston siege, and that was a terrible time. And but then then we the war really takes on a whole different footing when the British bring in a massive force under General Howe into Staten Island and then the greater New York City, with a fleet larger than the Spanish Armada. And the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn. Again, you can't overstate what a incredible disaster that was for the Americans. 3,000 killed, and again, ultimately, many, many taken prisoners. So much so that throughout the course of the war, no less than 10,000, but I think the number is believed to be higher, would suffer and die on incredibly wretched prison ships in New York Harbor. And so that's the backdrop. And then it's going so badly, when we declare independence, just a month or so before the Battle of Long Island. So the very aspirational. And of course, the signers knew that if this doesn't go well, as Benjamin Franklin says, we better all hang together, where we assuredly will hang separately. And so Franklin is then dispatched to France in a desperate diplomatic effort in October of 1776, shortly after Nathan Hale is hung in New York City. I mean, this whole enterprise is going very badly, and of course, the suffering American army was encamped outside of Philadelphia in a Valley Forge. Washington, we can't overstate the heroics of what was accomplished on Christmas night of 1776, and then the victories at Trenton and at Princeton. And they certainly kept the campfires burning and then some. The heroism, the leadership, and for morale, but it didn't reset the war. I mean, these were tactical victories, maybe strategic psychologically, and certainly I don't want to understate the importance of those earlier victories. But when you get into, and this is a great pivot. Let me conclude quickly. But when you get into the spring of 1777, I think certainly historians know with the benefit of hindsight, but even at the time, there was a clear understanding that General Howe was going to be on the move in that spring and summer. And Washington's main army was going to be in the crosshairs. And in fact, that was General Howe's objective, was to find and destroy Washington's main army, and by extension, the continental capital of Philadelphia, the nation's largest city, which he ultimately did, succeed in achieving those objectives. He didn't destroy Washington's army, but they were terribly battered after a number of battles. But at the same time, so we had this gathering storm there of Howe on the move, and they didn't know. He did a feint. They didn't know if he was coming overland via New Jersey. He ultimately went by water through Maryland and Delaware up into Philadelphia. But at the same time, General John Burgoyne had received approval from London to have a campaign, an operation from Quebec with the objective of seizing Albany. And so this is the movie or the film that's played at the Saratoga National Historical Park for 20 minutes in the Visitor Center is called Something More at Stake. And so something indeed was more at stake that summer, with this very large gathering storm of General Howe and General Burgoyne. And here's the point. If General Burgoyne succeeds in taking Albany, and there's a lot of recent scholarship as to how expansive his campaign was, and maybe it wasn't a full pincer action, and it really was just maybe he heading to Albany and General St. Leger or St. Leger heading from the west to reinforce him. But certainly General Clinton did come up. It wasn't imaginary. He did come up and take Forts Clinton and Montgomery with the size of a force of 2,000 to 4,000, and then he burns the new New York State Capitol to the ground, Kingston, on October the 6th. It's hard to fully understand why General Clinton didn't continue further north to Albany to reach Burgoyne. I think it might have been intelligence that, and we'll get to this, but there was a massive turnout of the militia from mostly New England and upstate New York, and I think they probably perhaps knew that there would have been a reckoning if they had gone any further, and that Burgoyne really was, his fate was sealed. But the point is, and maybe for your listeners, the Philadelphia fell on September the 26th, right between the two battles of Saratoga, the Battle of Freeman's Farm, that was a costly victory for the British. They held the field that day, but they didn't take the high ground of Bemis Heights. And but then on October the 7th, the Battle of Bemis Heights, a very decisive tactical victory for the Americans, but Philadelphia fell. So, if Burgoyne then had succeeded in taking Albany, right, the question is he likely would have been controlling most of the corridor from Quebec to New York City of the Lake Champlain down to Albany, and then would General Clinton have been able to control the rest of the Hudson Valley? So it would, I think it would have been the beginning of the end and a near knockout blow. So that's a lot of talking, but fortunately that didn't happen. And the reason this gets to the why it's not just me. We have a really large group now of an advisory committee that's emerging to fortify our project. We already have great military historians. It's a veteran-owned project and a lot of military families involved. But we really are widening the circle now because this is a story that must be told, and it must be told, I think, via a major motion picture masterpiece and hopefully a companion uh, multi-episode or multi-season series, sort of like Saving Private Ryan and then A Band of Brothers, because and I do a lot of talking. Jake, you're really patient with me
No,
here.
it's
Is
all good. I love to hear it.
well, here's the really for the point is that what was at stake was they didn't have to come. Is really my one of the points that I make. The massive turnout of the militia and Dr. James Kirby Martin and both Kevin Weddle and Eric Schnitzer and all of their books and scholarship cover this. They're like a dream team of historians, and there are many others, many of the staff at the Saratoga National Historical Park. But the Continental Army or the American Army that was dug in the Upper Hudson Valley, they they were not the equal of Burgoyne's force, and so but Washington had matured considerably as an overall commander in chief, and he knew that he couldn't just keep all of the assets with his main army, and so particularly when Burgoyne had left Quebec, and then certainly when Fort Ticonderoga fell in early July, there was a mad dash to really quickly fortify the northern department, but let's geographically, it was the foothills of the Adirondacks and the upper Hudson Valley. So, and what Washington did four things and the fourth component I think was really crucial, but obviously he sent General Benedict Arnold, and then he sent Colonel Daniel Morgan and his rifle corps of 400 to 500 men. They were these sharpshooters. Their rifles were the best of the day and twice the range of the British muskets. Pardon me, and they wreaked havoc on the British officer corps in both battles. And it's my understanding that Colonel Morgan's rifle corps was the first unit sent in on both Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. He was the tip of the spear. So it really, you can't overstate how effective Morgan's force was in the battles of Saratoga. But what also General Washington did, so he's obviously sent Morgan and his rifle corps. General Gates had made the decision to send Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko up. And even though he wasn't the head engineer, there was another one that I'm told, that was in charge of all the bridges and the like. But Kosciuszko was a prodigy. I mean, it's remarkable the contributions he made throughout the war, especially at such a young age. And his fortifications, forced Burgoyne in off of that gauntlet there on the river and into terrain that was favorable to the Americans. And then Washington also sent cannon from his own artillery train. Didn't have to do that, but he did. It showed great wisdom, I think, and judiciousness. But he also then said he had a dire call to arms, and that went out mainly through Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who was in charge of the militia in much of New England and Massachusetts, but also through General John Stark and New Hampshire and Seth Warner in Vermont and others. But they didn't know what that turnout would be. But at the outset, as it's been conveyed to me by the best military historians on this topic, the American Army was roughly in a 1-to-1 ratio with Burgoyne in the early part of late August, early September. But here for your listeners, let's pause just so it really for impact. Over the next 6 weeks, the American Army goes from a 1-to-1 to a 2-to-1 to a 3-to-1 ratio. So much so that they not only have a very decisive victory at Bemis Heights on October the 7th, but then they're able to cut off, completely surround, and lay total siege to Burgoyne's starving and shattered army. Now, again, the best minds of the day can discuss whether or not Burgoyne would have been able to limp back with his force to Fort Ticonderoga and then Quebec. Um, I think there's a strong case that he might have been able to do that because look, no British army had ever surrendered in history. So I think there's sort of a rebuttable presumption that they would have made their way back. Very decimated, of course, maybe a lot of prisoners being taken with the Americans in hot pursuit. But what is, and again, one of the reasons that perhaps Saratoga hasn't been accorded the seriousness or the gravity that I think this victory, this complete strategic victory that it was, perhaps was because of one of the main heroes, Benedict Arnold, who his leadership, his courage, and his heroics on the battlefield, which were in a very timely way and can't be overstated either. And he was grievously wounded on October the 7th at Bemis Heights. But Benedict Arnold himself did not force Burgoyne's surrender. And I always say, let's take a step back. What forced John Burgoyne's army to completely surrender? Because that's the ace in the hole that Benjamin Franklin was given, was the news of Burgoyne's total surrender at Saratoga. And I think there's a strong case to be made. This is the first surge in American history. At the 11th hour, average citizen soldiers who belonged to various state militia, and most of them were farmers, and they were busy with the harvest that time of year. They said to their families and their spouses and to their communities, and I say to their God, and they'd borne much of the burden of the Revolution to date. Much of those that were in New England, but they did come. They did answer the call, and they saved the day. The sacred fire of liberty was very close to being extinguished. If the British take both Albany and Philadelphia in rapid succession, the war may drag on, but I think it's hard to make the case that the Americans ultimately succeed, especially without the French coming into the war. So let me pause, Jake, because that's a big mouthful there.
No, that's beautifully stated. I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things that I talked about with Kevin. And one of the things that's so inspiring to me is these are regular townspeople. These are regular citizens, regular folks, men who heeded the call of duty to fight for liberty and like you stated, not let that flame of liberty be extinguished. And in doing the work that I do, that is why I do it. I feel that I look back on my ancestors and I look back on American history and I look back on the men and women who have built our nation. And I feel that I have been passed down a flame. I've been passed down a torch, and it's my responsibility to carry that torch and to tell their stories. And it fills me with so much pride as an American to tell those stories and to bring to light the trials and tribulations that our ancestors, our patriots have gone through to keep that flame of liberty burning, to keep America as that beacon on the hill. And to the greater point that you made of kind of zooming out and seeing how all of it is connected and not just looking at the story here at Saratoga and seeing how it's all connected is a great point. And that's one of sort of the epiphanies I've had as I've studied history and developed a more comprehensive understanding of how the events play into each other and lead to the next. I think I really had that epiphany when I was really studying World War II and seeing how that led into the Cold War. And it's crazy because it's all just an ever flowing cycle of history. I was gonna shift the focus a little bit to not just looking at Saratoga as a military victory and a turning point strategically and militarily, but it showed the world that a group of citizens, a ragtag army who was fighting for what they believed in, could stand up to the greatest empire in the world at that time. And that's really what secured that French assistance. And I want to tie it into film here. I think you can really sort of tie this into Rocky. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an underdog story.
Well, there's so many things to talk about here. I loved the former General Colin Powell, and he had thought that the American GI should have been nominated as the person of the 20th century for all that they did in World War I and World War II, et cetera. And I often quote Ronald Reagan. It was one of my heroes growing up, and he always said to Americans, "Never forget your heroic origins." And it's sometimes that's not the ethos that's sort of inculcated or in the spirit in the schools, and that needs to be fixed truly. But John F. Kennedy himself said in 1961, in January of 1961, the battle for American freedom was begun by the thousands of farmers and tradesmen who made up the Minutemen, citizens who are ready to defend their liberty at a moment's notice. Today, we need a nation of Minutemen, citizens who are not only prepared to take up arms, but citizens who regard the preservation of freedom as a basic purpose of their daily life and who are willing to consciously work and sacrifice for that freedom. The cause of liberty, the cause of America, cannot succeed with any lesser effort. I mean, I don't think you can improve upon that. And also, I would, I love the analogy of the shining city on the hill. And I'm forgetting the wonderful. He's about 103, the American paratrooper who was over at the 80th anniversary on D-Day. And I'm sorry I can't summon his last name now. He said, Jake, exactly what you said. He had a wonderful audience of young French and American um, teenagers in front of him, and he said to him, we are passing you the torch. And Ronald Reagan often said this, that liberty is fragile, and others have said this, of course, too. It must be passed from each generation to the next. So Franklin Roosevelt invoked this in one of his inaugural addresses, but and Thomas Jefferson as well. I mean, the metaphor of the sacred fire of liberty is so powerful, but that torch is indeed something that people must understand, must be firmly grasped by each generation. So yes, we the film needs to bring this out, and it needs to be the main axis by which the story is told.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially with the younger generation, I think these histories and these principles are all too easily forgotten, especially in today's divided political climate. I mean, I'm a political junkie. I love politics and I love studying it, but I think it's much more important to look past that and relish in our shared history, because that's what's important here. And that's really, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but that's really the true meaning of this film. Is it's not a telling of the Battle of Saratoga and what happened there. It's not a telling of the history there. It's a celebration of the history and the men who built America.
Absolutely, Jake. And I could have bought a home once I paid off my student loans, but I just had this gnawing voice that this was something that had to be done. I did have a partner for a time. The project was based in California. We tried to get the studios to take this. So if the studios are listening, shame on you. There's too many zombie movies and remakes of the Marvel comic stuff. I mean, that's all so trite and hackneyed. I mean, especially with this commemorative period, what's the other the vampires and the zombies? They come on, that's just a wasteland of nonsense. Maybe it sells all the horror movies and the gratuitous violence. Like, no, our history is really worth telling, and especially done in an incredible way. And we knew that Ken Burns was going to come in and do a multi-part series on the Revolution. That was likely, and he's going to release that next year. But even Ken Burns, who's a master of his genre, but he's getting a little bit too much of a bent. And I've talked about this in the last piece, the evil institution of slavery. And it was a global institution, and we did reckon with that with the terrible Civil War. But the existence of slavery at the time of our founding does not nullify our founding or the Great Experiment. I mean, that was a demon that we had to slay, or a dragon we had to slay, and we did. But it doesn't. We shouldn't be ashamed to talk about this incredibly important, vitally important story. There's so many things I want to add, but maybe for your listeners, why should you believe in not only me but this project? When I was an Eagle Scout, I did a Vietnam Veterans Memorial in my hometown. I didn't like the way Vietnam veterans were treated when they returned, and the park in East Northport, New York, didn't have a memorial for Vietnam veterans. It was for every other war, and so we fixed that. And I did encounter a lot of resistance, but ultimately that monument, that memorial, still is there. And I was proud that it made Boys Life magazine all those years ago in 1987. As a result of that, I got to go to the Congressional Youth Leadership Program in Washington, D.C., the very week that Ronald Reagan was meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in Washington. But I had unexpectedly the honor of helping to lay the wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier as a high school senior.
Wow,
And
that's
then
amazing.
later, I'm part of the lineage of America's fighting force in that I served in the U.S. Army, but all of my relatives were Irish immigrants, so we really didn't have roots that were here at the time of the Revolution. But it doesn't, and in any way, lessen our zeal, my family's zeal for the story of America. In fact, we were so grateful and profoundly indebted to America. But maybe last point on this is I even recently did a very large family inscription out at the immigrant Wall of Honor at Ellis Island because of all that. My grandfather had two aunts and an uncle who were responsible for bringing over about 25 nieces and nephews over a 30 to 40-year period. And so we finally codified that in on that wall. And so I've always been trying to make sure that certain stories aren't forgotten. And I want to pause because, and we'll talk about the story, the movie and the film here in a minute, but there are so many institutions and organizations doing vitally important work in this space, and you want to thank them all. But the American Battlefield Trust and Mount Vernon, Fort Ticonderoga, of course, the Saratoga National Historical Park, and others. And so, and we need to keep that sustained. And I want Americans to know that this 250th period should not just be celebrated in 2026 for the 250th the signing of the Declaration, the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, but the entirety of the 8-year period. So, and that's, we want to link in everyone's mind that without Saratoga, we don't get to Yorktown. And I said on the last podcast I was on, Benjamin Franklin got it right. I mean, he was one of our greatest Americans. If he and Washington, arguably the two greatest besides Lincoln, and he had a coin minted while he was in Paris. And on that coin was featured the victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, the first two times that a British army was forced to surrender in history. Now, it doesn't at all diminish the importance of other victories and struggles in the Revolution, but it does tell the listeners and the American public that these two victories were uniquely special. And right, one occurred on October the 17th of 1777, and the other one occurred 4 years later, almost to the date, on October the 19th of 1781. And maybe one other quick point on this, and I was astounded. Dr. James Kirby Martin and others reminded me of this. More than half of Washington's force at Yorktown was comprised of pardon me, of French forces, both under General Rochambeau and, of course, Admiral de Grasse. So, right, we don't win at Yorktown without the French. I mean, we have to say that they were massively important. The French assistance and intervention on the American cause. And maybe, Jake, one other point, if we could, and I'll just yield quickly. I love it. We don't just talk about the grit, the courage and grit and love and the hardship and sacrifice, but the faith. Early Americans were not atheists, and the signers of the Declaration, they put their hands in the fate of divine providence, or I should say, their fates in the hands of divine providence. Pardon me. And we have an inspiring words section on our website, 1777.org, and I want all Americans, especially agnostics and atheists and others, to go on there, and those who are their faith may be wavering. Our greatest leaders all throughout American history, during the Civil War, during the Civil Rights Movement, including Martin Luther King and Lincoln, Patton and MacArthur and Eisenhower, right back to our very beginning of our founding, they invoked our Creator at every turn. And they didn't just invoke the Creator. They really knew that we did need help and that assistance. And for some, that may seem preposterous, but it's there. That common thread is throughout our history. And so it's not just having faith in your fellow man and fellow woman. We had to have faith in a higher power, because it wasn't likely that these citizen soldiers were going to beat the most powerful empire on earth. But let me pause, Jake.
Yeah, 100%. That's a fantastic point, and one that I wholeheartedly agree with. In those desperate times of struggle, in those darkest hours, you have to have something higher to believe in. If those men don't have something higher to believe in, it's all too easy to completely give up hope and say, well, what's the point? It's not worth it. But having that higher power to believe in gives you that guiding hand and that sense of hope that it is all going to work out.
Could I quickly add, not that we get into a philosophy on the American founding and the Constitution, but well, people have to understand that the founders, the ideals and principles that they incorporated into our founding documents, these didn't just come from the European Enlightenment, but this goes all the way back to the Magna Carta and to the Christian Gospels and to the Old Testament and of course ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So the entirety or the totality of Western civilization, all of the best learnings have been incorporated. And again, to say otherwise is not only disingenuous, it's profoundly mistaken. And it's all there. I mean, any serious scholarship would yield those conclusions. And so, people can be dismissive of the importance of faith, but it's if you study American history, it's there. That indelible footprint is there from the very beginning.
I think that's a mistake. Looking at, I mean, Western civilization, especially America, whether people want to admit it or not, was built on Christian Judaic values. And I think the true erosion of a society comes when institutions like church and family are eroded. And I think we do see a little bit of that today. And I think that's especially why it's so important to look back on our history and stuff like this, to see our shared history and how we were built and created.
Right, and that there was an American journalist. I'll leave her name out for now, but a few months ago, she was so brazen and spoke, and she was saying that and this isn't about modern partisan politics, but she was saying about one movement today that they were so misguided that they believe our rights don't come from government or some force, but come from God, and she thought they were just zealots. She really embarrassed herself profoundly because it was sad because she's otherwise obviously a very intelligent, accomplished journalist, but to show that obviously in her journalism and communications classes she didn't get a proper foundation in philosophy and political philosophy clearly because no, it was an asinine, profoundly wrong statement, and we know all of our founders know that our rights are not derived from government. Government is only there to secure those rights. Those rights come from our Creator. That's why they're inalienable. So it was shocking. I think it wasn't really much of a retraction. I think she should even have made an apology, and hopefully no American journalist or professor makes such a grave mistake again in the future.
Yeah, exactly. The purpose of government is to protect those rights. They don't create them because then it's too easily abused. But I want to focus on the fact that you're a veteran, and this is one of your main marketing points for the film. You're a U.S. Army veteran. You've made it very clear this is a veteran-owned, independent project. Why is that important to you?
Jake, thank you for that question. And this is where I look to my fellow Americans, my fellow citizens, fellow patriots, and fellow veterans. Hollywood is not going to make this movie. I hope I'm wrong. And we would love to partner with them. And we would love for Steven Spielberg and the other greats to step up. But, and it would be great to believe that we could do this via crowdfunding. And we do have a presence on Give, Send, Go. And certainly there's a lot of wealth in this nation, and we give an awful lot of money to the political campaigns. But the reason it's important that it's a veteran led effort and owned effort and comprised of distinguished military historians, and we have an advisory council that everyone will see soon on our website that speaks for itself. It will be leaders from the Association of the U.S. Army, the American Legion, the VFW, the Military Officers Association of America, and the sons and of the American Revolution and the daughters of the American Revolution, etc. But is that we are going to have a fidelity to this history. We're not going to take liberties. Anyway, the movie The Patriot was entertaining and well done in many respects, but fictionalized. We don't need to take license with this. And I even listened to the Rev 250 podcast earlier today about the Washington spy ring on Long Island, and even regrettably, the Washington spies the turn. They just took liberties that they didn't need to. Why you would deviate from the history is when they do that, it shocks me, because unless it's really necessary, but if you have a great story, you just don't need to do that. And what here's the short answer. As a veteran, I believe we have a sacred duty to tell the story as it happened and to honor their legacy. And they're right. They can't speak for themselves anymore. They're relying on us to get it right. So that's sort of the covenant that we have with our forebearers. Why would you like do violence to the history and fictionalize it, or make take liberties that you don't need to? So I think and the American people want to know that, right? People always get upset when they see a movie that's otherwise been done well, but they butcher certain parts because they fictionalize it and get it wrong. And I think veterans, what we are saying is we can be trusted more than Hollywood on this front as an independent project. We will if this goes to production, we will stay true to the history.
Yeah, that's something that's very important to you and on the forefront of your mind is staying true to the history and having that historical integrity, because you're right, when you have a fascinating story and an exciting story and an action-packed story, there's no reason to dramatize that.
Not at all. And I should say that's where I'm not afraid to ask for help. We need our fellow Americans' help, and I'm asking everyone to stand with us. Join us in this effort. This may arguably be the first time in American history that a film about the American Revolution is being done by America's veterans. I think similar efforts were done on the Civil War. There's so many great productions on the Civil War, but this is a unique opportunity. And this is not, again, this isn't Mark O'Rourke. We have now an amazing team, and I'm asking people to link arms with us. This is our project. I said this on an earlier podcast. We want to democratize this effort. So join with us. Email us at info at 1777.org. And you can DM us also on the various at 77 Turning Point. But please get in touch with us. And if you look, we want Kelsey Grammer to play Benjamin Franklin. We want Gary Sinise. We want Denzel Washington. We want some of the best heavy hitters in American history involved with this project. And here's a plug. Where everything's on the table. We're willing for much of the net proceeds to go to the likes of the Gary Sinise Foundation or TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, to the Gold Star families. This isn't about making money for us. We want to get this done, and we're willing for this to be an incredibly enduring legacy to help America's families and veterans and those who have been wounded in service to their nation.
Yeah, I think that's eloquently stated. I want to read a little excerpt from the website here. This project will mark the first time that America's veterans are being asked to directly support the creation of a movie focused on telling the story of American Army's first strategic victory that became the turning point of the American War for Independence. So that's a very profound opportunity there, and one that you laid out very clearly, that this could be the first time that a movie about the American Revolution is made by veterans.
Absolutely. And I do have to say, I did write that. I've given a lot of thought. Everything, I hope everyone really will visit our website, 1777.org. We've been at this for many years and we've really tried to get it right. And I hope people will be inspired. And what I feel comfortable at this point, Jake, is we ultimately want to give Americans an informed choice. They often complain about the content that they're able to access from Hollywood and the like. And there's a lot of great content, of course, but it's certainly now with streaming platforms, there's a demand for quality content. But we this is not going to happen unless there is a groundswell of support from our fellow Americans and Americans of high net worth. I mean, I we saw that Bernie Marcus, a great patriot, is in Atlanta, who's got a fortune of 7 billion plus, was looking to give away some of his fortune. Bernie, you can be co-producer. Your legacy will be forever cemented. Or Diane Hendricks, or Elon Musk, or whomever. This isn't both sides of the aisle. But if you can write a check, we'll make sure that you're remembered. You will be. We'll put your name in lights, and you can help. Let's pause so everyone understands. Everything is done on this project. We have an amazing screenplay. All of the infrastructure is in place. We can hire an A-list director and go to the production phase if we get the funding. And that's a big deal, of course. There's many movie projects that are still on the shelf for lack of funding. But this isn't any other movie effort. There's a lot of garbage out there. I mean, well, I'm just going to say that in the vernacular. This isn't garbage. This is one of the most important stories in American history. This is our turning point. And so I'm a proud New Yorker. One third of the battles of the revolution were fought on New York soil, and arguably more major battles than any other state. But this isn't just about New York. That's territorial. But I do want to plug that, Boston, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and South Carolina have bested us over the generations. New York now, with this 250th period, has a unique opportunity, and I hope Governor Hochul and our state congressional delegation really are listening. Many have been supportive. We have an opportunity to elevate the Turning Point Trail, that includes a little bit of Vermont, but mostly New York, to the same level of recognition as Boston's Freedom Trail. Massachusetts, they're good right often at starting things. I make a joke, I'm kidding. But they started the revolution, and they were quite. I'm a Yankee fan, so I love to needle the Red Sox nation. And but they started the revolution. They were heroic. But in upstate New York in 1777, the revolution was saved. Period. Hard stop. The revolution was saved. The miracle, that was the exclamation point at Saratoga. But also for your listeners, but this is another quick point. A feature film usually can't be more than about 2.5 hours. And so getting from Burgoyne launching his campaign from Quebec, the fall of Fort Ticonderoga, and then the battles of Saratoga and the siege and surrender. That's a lot to get in 2.5 hours. And we also, a lot of people think our project may be missing a couple of important points, and we're not. The overwhelming, incredible victory at Bennington, which occurred on New York soil, that Burgoyne's force was, their destination was in Bennington, then the New Hampshire territory, but present day Vermont. They didn't reach Bennington. That battle occurred entirely in New York soil in Williamsack, New York, in Rensselaer County near Hoosick Falls, and they were about 10 miles from Bennington. And that victory, led by General John Stark and Colonel Seth Warner, reduced Burgoyne's force by almost 1,000. Lost a lot of the German soldiers that with him, and his First Nation warriors, his Native American scouts, and others. And that was vitally important. So some argue that Bennington was the beginning of the turning point, and there's a fair case to be made for that. But then the other part is, and of course, all of the fighting was done to delay Burgoyne as he came down from after taking Fort Ticonderoga at Fort Anne and Fort Edward, et cetera. And the other piece I just want to quickly mention is the incredible sacrifice that occurred in the Mohawk Valley by the Americans and our Native American allies in making sure that General or Lieutenant Colonel, but they gave him a temporary title of General, Barry St. Leger, he did not succeed. There was a botched siege of Fort Stanwix. So there was an entirety or a totality that occurred in upstate New York in that summer that ensured that Burgoyne was not successful. And so we can't overlook those. And I like to plug, there are some that are jaundiced too, but Jake, if I could mention, some often feel that at this period of time, this period piece, it's one demographic. So it's just not the case. Yes, many of the citizen soldiers in the American Army was overwhelmingly white, but from different backgrounds, Irish, German, French, Dutch, etc. But the mosaic was vast, even from the beginning. No less than 500 of the American force of 17,000 plus were free and enslaved African Americans. They fought shoulder to shoulder with their fellow Americans. And then, of course, our Native American allies. And I want to plug, so I hope everyone from the United Nations is listening, and the Tuscaroras, they were the only part of the Iroquois that sided with the Americans. The rest of the Iroquois nation was aligned with the British. And they were incredibly, made incredible contributions to the American cause at the siege of Fort Stanwix at Saratoga, and they even helped us from starving at Valley Forge. And then lastly, and then I'll yield. To the next question is the Stockbridge militia out of Western Massachusetts, comprised mainly of the Mohegan, the Wappinger, and the Munsee tribes. And I commend all of my fellow Americans to read about them and how they suffered. And even as down in the Battle of White Plains, Their bravery is unparalleled, and we can't forget their contributions to the American cause.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely a testament to our diverse history. But I think you made a great point earlier talking about Hollywood and the movie studios and the streaming services. And as someone who's fairly tapped into, the movie industry, a connoisseur of cinema, I can assure you that audiences are yearning for stories with deeper meaning. People are tired of the cash grabs, the cheap movies that they're just pumping out for money with no deeper meaning, no deeper philosophy, no human story to tell. People are yearning for those movies that tell a human story. But I do want to linger a little bit on the veteran aspect of things. You're a US Army veteran. I want to shift a little bit. Forgive me. I want to shift a little bit from the movie here. What was that experience like for you as a US Army veteran?
Well, one of the great regrets of my life was ever leaving the U.S. military. It was the privilege of a lifetime to wear the uniform. I did very, very well, with my evaluations. So I think I would have had a decent shot at a good career. I was mentored by some of the best non-commissioned officers and officers in the military. It it was really. I look back with incredible fondness. I learned a great deal generally, but about myself, but about others. I couldn't have handpicked most of the time the better people to have worked with. And I went in a year after the Gulf War, and I got out a year before 9/11. And I did lose a dozen friends, high school and college classmates in 9/11. And I'd just been out of law school and was quite honestly had a lot of debt. And I wish I had returned to the military even then. My father is an Army National Guard veteran. He was a sergeant. He was also a police officer who was shot in the line of duty. And then he became a New York City firefighter and ultimately a New York City fire chief, deputy chief. And he retired just a year or so before 9/11. And my twin brother is my identical twin brother, an Army veteran, and my grandfather's brother fought in World War II in the Army. And we have many, many others in our family. I even had a great grandfather who got a citizenship when he came over from Ireland by fighting in the Spanish American War. So our family's history in the U.S. Army and the military goes way back. But no, it was transformative. It was a very formative period for my character and development. And my respect is profound. And I'll tell your listeners, I fortunately I never had the duty where I had to notify next of kin of someone that was killed while on active duty, but I did have to present a flag to a father, and he was himself a World War II veteran, and his son was a decorated veteran of both Vietnam and the Persian Gulf. And I won't say the family's name here, but for privacy. But I was in South Carolina in the summer of 1996, and I'll never forget that. And he should have been given a full military detail, but then there were cutbacks. Only World War II veterans and those killed while on active duty got a full ceremonial detail. And so in my case, I was the only uniform member I was an officer and went to the funeral to present a flag. And you do so on behalf of the President of the United States and the American people when you do that ritual. And there's no higher honor. I'll certainly tell you that when you get on bended knee and present a flag to a grieving family member. That's
Yeah, I can imagine that was probably a breathtaking experience.
Could I also add? I'm getting a little choked up, but on my last podcast, I had Hobson, Debbie Hobson. She goes by now. I used to know as Deb, um, and she was one of the finest soldiers that I served with back in the 513th Military Intelligence Brigade, both at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and Fort Gordon, Georgia, and it's now been renamed Fort Eisenhower. But she and her husband were two of the nicest and most beloved people that in our unit and beyond, and very, very capable Arabic linguist and strategic debriefers and hazardous materials handlers. And I could go on air load planners. Even combat medics. Like her husband, Ken, Staff Sergeant Kenneth Hobson, was as competent of an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, as one could meet. And that's why I want this film to celebrate. The film is done in his honor, and also to all the 17,000 plus soldiers that served But not only at Saratoga, but in the entirety of upstate New York, but even the Revolution. We often celebrate just the generals, and that's so misguided. And but Ken lost his life. Ken made the ultimate sacrifice in service to the nation 26 years ago. It's approaching the anniversary on August 7th of 1998 in the incredibly evil Al Qaeda bombing of the American embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. And Ken was one of the finest persons and soldiers and Americans that I ever had the privilege of meeting. And so I had always wanted to do something meaningful to honor him. So that's also why I say, let's bring this back to the film. It's awfully unfair, but life is unfair. We got to get this done no matter, even if life is unfair, Jake. But I want to say to Gary Sinise and Denzel Washington and Kelsey Grammer and others that can help us, and there are many, Mark Wahlberg and Kevin Sorbo, whomever, and even and Steven Spielberg and the likes, maybe perhaps Tom Hanks, is yes, when often a film gets fully funded, everyone will flock to the production, but that's a tall order. But you can take a leap of faith and you can attach your talent as a director and as actors to a project to propel it forward. And we're asking for that. And if you read our screenplay, it rivals anything that the Hollywood would do. It's from smarter people, and we have Robert Burris is our screenwriter. He's an industry screenwriter, but Dr. James Kirby Martin is one of the finest military historians the nation's ever known, and it's we also have as edited and advised by Kevin Weddle, but we'll also be including others as we move forward. But we need some of the heavy hitters to step forward and to move this project forward in a seismic way, and we're asking them to do just that.
Yeah, I mean, I really do hope they're watching because a film of this scale and importance deserves to be told with the highest quality possible, with the best talent possible. So I do really hope that you get your wish and that this film is told by the heavy hitters, like you said.
Can I add, Jake? We have added almost 40,000 social media followers in 9 months, and we'll get to 100,000 in the first 18 to 24 months. But that's a means, right? But that shows a level of interest. And if you look at all the interest in all of the Revolutionary War podcast and websites, it's very considerable. And if you look at the team that we've assembled, this is not an amateurish production, and we're worthy of people's confidence. So I asked them to reach out to us and to join us. I mean, they're like, how can you say enough about how much the likes of Denzel Washington and Gary Sinise and others have done over the years for our service members? And so I asked them, though, I really would be profoundly humbled if they would come in and join us.
Another aspect of this filmmaking process that I learned about on your website was the fact that you plan on filming these stories at the actual sites these events took place or near them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The movie The Last of the Mohegans, one of the most important films on that history that occurred in New York, upstate New York, and it was beautiful production. The third iteration of that movie that features Daniel Day Lewis, who would also love to have involved in this project. I'm told he's retired, but would like to bring him out of retirement. Um, but that was filmed entirely down in North Carolina or Georgia. New York State didn't have a New York State film tax credit program, and now we have one of the better ones in the nation. And so if we reach the production phase, this will be filmed in the Adirondacks, in the Upper Hudson Valley, in Lake Champlain, Lake George, and on the Hudson River, and the hills above the Hudson, and out in the Mohawk Valley. We will be true to the cinematography. It's upstate New York in the autumn. There's very few places in the nation that are more beautiful, and then also with an ethereal soundtrack that rivals what you would see in Dances with Wolves or Glory, Saving Private Ryan, or Last of the Mohegans.
Yeah, I think that's one of when I'm kind of visualizing this film, one of the most important aspects to me would be the score because the score is really what sets the tone for the film.
Absolutely. And so we want it if the dust settles on this, we want an A-list director, A-list cast, the most breathtaking cinematography, incredible soundtrack, and so that this is a timeless and enduring masterpiece that Americans At this darkest hour of the revolution, when all appeared to be lost, the average citizen soldier, with great leaders like we had with Colonel General Arnold and Colonel Morgan and Colonel Kosciuszko and many others, but all the citizen soldiers, this epic story will not be forgotten. Even before word came back from France, and that the French were then going to back the American cause militarily, which I believe my understanding is that that word came back in early February, perhaps. It might have been sooner. Word reached France in early December. I think it was December 4th or 6th when Benjamin Franklin got the news. But even before we knew the French were coming into the war, and it was truly a game changer, the Continental Congress, and I believe it was a unanimous resolution, declared that there would be a national day of solemn thanksgiving and praise. It was December 18th, 1777, 1 week before Christmas. And they gave thanks to Almighty God, to their fellow citizens, for this incredible providential victory. And not my words or any historian, when George Washington received the news, I mean, he got the news the day after. Can you imagine the guys or gals that were on, whoever it was that was on that horse, those fast horses on horseback, and they must have ridden all night continuously. They reached Washington, and after Washington's forces had been pummeled in a series of bloody engagements at Germantown and the battle, the Battle of the Brandywine, and then Germantown, and including the Paoli massacre, and they get this news. Washington then pens a letter to a fellow general, and he ascribes the victory to Providence, and he calls the revolution the glorious work that we have in hand. So if His Excellency George Washington ascribes our victory to Providence, no other American gets to trump that. So it's such a great story. We have to tell it. We have to inspire. We're at a crossroads as a nation, and we have to not only revisit our heroic origins, but Ronald Reagan used to say we have a rendezvous with destiny. Well, we have a rendezvous with history, with our history. If we're going to have a rendezvous with destiny, we have to recommit ourselves to the covenant of the great experiment. And to do that, we must know the courage and grit and hardship and sacrifice it took to secure our independence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the path to unifying the country and getting over the political partisanship is relishing in our shared history because at the end of the day, we're all Americans and we all came from the same place. But I'd like to give you the floor now to plug yourself. What can people do to bring this story to the big screen?
Well, first, I'm going to my fellow Americans, please, number one, pray. Pray for me, pray for the project. We've been at this a long time. It's been injurious financially, and it's a lot of peaks and valleys. This is tough sledding. The second thing is to spread the word. Please get your friends and family to follow us on social media at 77 Turning Point, and then 1777.org is the website. Third is if you can give, even in small denominations, visit our website and you can donate. It brings you to the Give, Send, Go website. Fourth, if you know some of the heavy hitters, like I've been mentioning in this call, needle them. Say, look, I know some of them may feel they're retired or they don't want to do another film. No, this one's worthy of your time. You'll be glad that you did this. Don't squander this opportunity. You'll be remembered for this production more than perhaps some of your other films. And then fifth is also, if you're an American of great net worth, maybe you'll be remembered for helping to co-found Home Depot or doing this or that in your corporate life or career. Come and be our fellow producer. Come and join us. Stand with us. You'll be remembered forever for creating one of the greatest movies in American history, about one of the greatest stories in American history. Join us. So that's we need help. So if you're an American out there and you're listening, we need cheerleaders. We need those who are going to link arms with us and help us move forward. This is our history and our story and our project. I hope my fellow Americans will look at it in just that way.
Yeah, I hope this podcast episode reaches as big of an audience as possible. I'm going to link all of the websites and links down in the description, but I'd like to conclude this discussion with a passage from the website to put into perspective the importance of this and to light a flame under the Americans to take action. The sacred fire of liberty, which ignited the American Revolution, is fueled by the courage, faith, grit, loyalty, love, and wisdom of the nation's patriots and veterans. The very foundation of our cherished republic, that was established upon the principles of liberty, equality, and justice, was forged by this very sacred fire. Over the generations, this fire has courageously defeated tyranny, secured the fundamental rights granted by our Creator, built a nation, saved a house divided against itself, crushed the serpent of slavery, conquered fascism, ended the scourge of segregation, and outlasted the brutality and immorality of communism and totalitarianism. America's patriots and veterans truly reflect what is best about our nation and remain its guiding beacon. We will never allow the sacred fire of liberty to be extinguished, nor permit anything to tread upon the noble experiment that has been entrusted to us and posterity. We will ensure that our nation's heroic origins are never forgotten as we maintain an unwavering fidelity to the oath that we solemnly took to defend the Constitution and our way of life. We will faithfully and securely pass the torch that holds this sacred flame to the next generation. This film project is a grateful salute to the patriots that courageously kept the sacred fire of liberty burning during one of the darkest hours of the American Revolution, when all appeared to be lost and America needed a miracle. They did their part. Now we must do ours. Please support this promising veteran-owned project so that this compelling story can be brought to the widest audience in time for the 250th anniversary of the turning point of the American War for Independence on October 17th, 2027.
Jake, thank you. Those are my words, and I can't add to that. Our fellow Americans recently saw the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and the Americans who were in those landing craft when the ramps went down, from the very founding of our patriots who came in and inspired by the spirit of "Don't tread on me." That same spirit, that same fire has been there the entire time, and we have to be true to that legacy. So I just I can't, and we do this myself, and we're asking others to join us in this effort. Thank you.
Beautifully and eloquently stated. Well, Mark, thank you very much. We will do our best to get this message to as wide of an audience as possible. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.